Welcome back. Remember, we've just looked at default constructor, so now we have to start looking at the next one, which is the well-known custom constructor. So that's where you get to define whatever you want in terms of initializer. So here's the example. I still left my default constructor here, but I added another one. And you notice that here I'm already making use of overloading. I have a second constructor that goes by the same name, which is student. However, the list of arguments is different. Student this time takes S, which is a reference to a constant string. And with that string in hand, I proceed with my initialization, and this time I will initialize name with the field, with the value S that I received as an argument. Then I initialize empty and final to 0. And that's all there is to it. It allows me to actually write some fairly simple piece of code like this one, for instance. I could say student star S equal new student, parenthesis, and now I can pass a string. For example, I could have said before string name equal Joe, and now here I would pass name, semicolon, and I'm done. That has allocated an object and called the default, called the custom constructor that's here, right? You notice that name, I'm receiving a reference, it's constant, so I cannot modify this guy, and I'm doing an assignment here. Now, it's maybe a little bit important to realize that if I go back to the discussion we just had last time, how many times is the name field initialized here? Well, think it through. When you enter student, you grab memory, then you enter the student constructor here, and you go to the initialization. But name and homeworks are objects. And because they are objects, what you're going to do is that you're going to call their default constructor. So the default constructor of name gets called and initializes name to a nil string, an empty string. Then we go on and we come here and we again initialize name, this time in a different way by assigning it a value. So there is something going on here. We're assigning, this is an assignment operator. We're assigning name to a value S, but it has already been initialized. So we're doing again that initialization twice, and you're thinking, hey, wait a second. A second ago, you were promising us that C++ was better than Java. We didn't have to initialize things twice. Why do I have to initialize it twice? And I say, you're right. You're absolutely right. My apology. I should actually have pointed out that there is an alternative syntax. Let me show it to you. What you can do, and I'll write it here, is the following. If I want, so let's go just on the edge. If I want to actually define a constructor, I could have said student, parenthesis, it's a T, parenthesis. Then I have my const, string, reference, and this is S. But rather than writing the body, I could have said colon, underscore name, parenthesis S. Then I put the curly brace and I initialize midterm and final to 0. And I'm done. That is my implementation. Notice how I've moved this I removed this assignment and I use this new syntax, which is colon, and then essentially it's a field followed by an initializer. And I could have several of them. I could have field 1, then a comma at the end, then field 2, and another initializer. And I could keep on going like that, and then finally hit my curly brace. What is going on here? Well, what is going on is that with this syntax, you are not letting the compiler invoke the default initializer for name. Instead, you're saying, I'm providing to you the initializer. I'm saying to initialize name, don't call the default constructor. called the custom constructor that takes as input a string. And that will initialize. And in this way, you initialize this only once. It gets only initialized once. And once this is done, I go inside the code. And since name is already initialized, I don't have to do it for the other field. Now, the last bit that's worth mentioning is that I don't have to do something as complex as that. You're saying, oh, that's funny because I have to remember that for objects I do this and for scalars I do that. Yes, I know it's ugly, so there is a better way to do it. Rather than putting this initialization, let's remove it. And instead, we're going to say name, comma, and then I'm going to say midterm 0, comma, final 0, and then I put a pair of curly braces with nothing in between. Now this constructor for student does the exact same thing as this one, right? They're equivalent from a semantic standpoint, but this one is more efficient because what it does is that it invokes not the default but a custom constructor for the name using the string as an argument. It treats my attributes exactly like object. So it initializes empty with 0 and final with 0. And finally, it invokes the default constructor on the vector of homeworks. And that completes the entire initialization. I have nothing else to do. So it's a little more efficient to do it this way. One requirement is that the fields here should be listed in the same order as the order of declarations in here. So if you put them, you should list them in the same order as that. And the order in which they will be initialized is not the order in which they are listed here. It's the order in which they are declared up here. So even if you think, oh, let's switch because I'd like to actually have this initialized before that, if you're doing that, you're making a design mistake. That shouldn't be because the initialization is driven by that. The only way to make sure you're doing the right thing is check this. By the way, the compiler, if you were to reorganize this field and have them in a different order than that, the compiler will issue a warning if asked to, saying that the ordering here and here are inconsistent. That's a reminder that it will use this one for the order in which it does the initialization, not that. So pay attention to this. It's a subtle thing. And by the way, now I can finally start pointing you to the second book, because this is one of the tips that's given in the book. And I will do so on the website. For each section we'll cover, I will say, go read tip number 12, 14, 72, 39. Well, there are only 52 tips. But that will be the idea, because those tips relate to some of these aspects, which are typical pitfalls when you're starting with C++. You may think that the order matters. No, the order that matters is this one, right? So I will refer you back to that book, Effective C++, for reading on these gems that basically point out this is good practice, this is bad practice, this is how you should do it, right? So that's the important thing. So that's it. We're done with the custom constructor. Now we need to dive into the next kind, which are copy constructor. See you next time.